Good afternoon, Mr. Edward Carwardine. It is a great pleasure to welcome you to our event. My name is Fatima Jabarova, and I'm a grade 11 student of the Modern Educational Complex named in honor of Heydar Aliyev, and we're all very thrilled to have you here today. Thank you very much for joining us.
It's my pleasure. Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you both.
Hello, Mr. Carwardine. My name is Rafiq Asimov. I'll be the other host tonight. I'm also the 11th grade student of the Modern Educational Complex named in honor of Heydar Aliyev. And I would just like to say it's a great honor to have you today interviewed. And we are, I think, amongst the luckiest, if not the luckiest people to have you here tonight. And so the children of our school actually prepared some questions for you, and I would happily present it to you if you don't mind.
Please go ahead. I'm more than ready.
Okay. So let's move on, shall we? So first of all, I would just like to know, how did you start your career in UNICEF?
Well, it's been a long time, so I have to think back over many years to answer this question. But I actually began working with UNICEF back in 1997. And I started out working in our office in the United Kingdom, which is where I'm from originally. I was involved in a lot of our fundraising and community relations work, really to encourage people to support UNICEF's work and learn more about UNICEF's work around the world. So I did that for several years, and while I was there, I did a few pieces of work with some of our offices in different parts of the world. In India, for example, where I worked for several months on behalf of UNICEF, helping the office in India. From there, I eventually moved on after about 3 years London to our office in Geneva, again, sort of working around communications and media relations. And then I went to Afghanistan in the beginning of 2002, when there were a lot of changes happening in Afghanistan after the fall of the Taliban regime and really a new part of Afghanistan's history. So I was working there with UNICEF for about 4.5 years. From there, I went on to work in Sudan, in North Africa, again at a very exciting time. It was the end of a very long civil war in Sudan, so a lot of things were changing, a lot of new opportunities, particularly for children and young people. So I was very pleased to work there again for about 3.5 or 4 years. Before moving to Indonesia, I went over to Asia and worked in our office in Indonesia for several years. Again, most of this work was around building partnerships, working on communications with the public and with the media and so on. And then I found myself in New York, which is where UNICEF's headquarters is. I was the Deputy Director of Communications for UNICEF for several years, working out of New York and very much involved around some of the big issues at that time, including the conflict in Syria and the Middle East. It was also the time when the Ebola pandemic really hit West Africa. We talk a lot about COVID now. Sometimes we forget that there was this big Ebola pandemic a few years ago in Africa. So I was involved in a lot of some of these big global issues with UNICEF. And then I came to Azerbaijan. I took over our office here. I'm the head of the office now in Azerbaijan, and I'm now into my 5th year, my final year actually, but my 5th year here in Azerbaijan. So it's been a long career. As I was telling you that, I began to feel very old when I was thinking back over all these years of experience. But it's been a very privileged career. I always say to people that I think I have one of the best jobs in the world. I feel extremely fortunate and extremely lucky that I have the chance not only to do the work that I do, but to see some of the countries that many people in the world would never have a chance to experience. And hopefully be a little bit of make a little bit of a contribution to the lives of children in these countries as well. So that's my 20+ years of UNICEF, and hopefully more to come. We'll see.
Well, we hope so. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Carwardine. Our grade 8R student, Nargiz Gubadova, asks, how can we help children from vulnerable groups of society?
Well, Nargiz, it's a very good question, and I think if we look around the world to start with, there has been, of course, a lot of progress for children generally. I think the lives of children overall have become much better since UNICEF has been in existence. We're actually marking our 75th year as UNICEF this year. And if we look back over those decades, clearly the situation generally for most children has improved to some extent. But of course, there are many children who still need support, who need assistance. And if we look at some of the challenges in the world related to poverty, we see the impact of climate change increasingly on children. And we see often really a difference between those families who have been successful in countries and those who are still being left behind. And I think that's a big part of UNICEF's work still, is trying to ensure that those children who are struggling don't slip further behind or become invisible amidst the general progress that we see in so many countries. So I think for how young people can get involved, I always say the first thing is get informed. Find out what's happening to children, either around the world or in your own country, or even right in your heart of your own community. And I think sometimes we don't see what happens to children because we don't necessarily experience it every day. And I think particularly in countries where there has been a lot of progress, where generally becoming more prosperous, where there are more opportunities, it becomes more difficult to see those children who are still being left behind. So I think, spending some time to understand what are the issues that affect children, finding out what's happening in your community, and then talking to others about it. I think the more that we share our knowledge and our information and we draw more attention to the challenges that children still face is a very practical way of really understanding the issues. And of course, in many countries, and Azerbaijan is one of them, there are many organizations that work in the communities to help children and families who are maybe struggling. And I think here in Azerbaijan, as an example, we do see this growing network of what we call civil society organizations or non-government organizations, foundations, and so on, who really are very active in the community and helping families who may be struggling economically, or where there are social problems in the family, where you have children with only one parent, or children who have disabilities. And I actually began my work before I began working in UNICEF after I left university many years ago, was working with a civil society organization in the United Kingdom, which I found a really rewarding experience. It really helped me to understand the life of people in the community where I was living. And I always recommend this to young people. If you get the chance to volunteer with a local organization, it's a good experience. I think it increases your understanding and your appreciation of the lives of families. And in fact, last year, you may recall that in Azerbaijan, His Excellency President Ilham Aliyev declared 2020 to be the year of the volunteer. And I hope that that sort of initiative really encourages young people to get active in their communities and see where they can offer their help, their assistance, and their support.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Carwardine, so 3 children of our school, so to be exact, the children from the 8th grade, 8A4 Isfandiyar Mukhtarov, 7th grade 7A Maryam Latifli, and 8R Aydan Karimova, has prepared a question. So which was the most successful in a massive global project of UNICEF, and which projects does UNICEF Azerbaijan plan for upcoming months, and how school children can become part of them?
Well, it's a good question, and it's perhaps not an easy one. The first part, at least, is not an easy question to think of, like UNICEF has done over so many years. As I say, this is now our 75th year as an organization. I think if we look back over UNICEF's history, a few examples come to mind, and maybe I can share just a couple of those, but this will not be a full list. I think just some specific examples. UNICEF actually began its work back in 1946. We were established by the United Nations just as the UN itself was created in 1945. A year later, UNICEF was created. And our work at that time was really only focused on countries in Europe that were recovering from the Second World War, which, as you know, affected so many countries across Europe. And we were providing basic support to children in those countries affected by the conflict, in terms of medical care and food supplies and so on. And we were never actually expected to be a long-term organization. I think the plan was that UNICEF would work for a number of years in these limited number of countries, and that would be all of the work that we did. But it became clear over that time that there was great potential for an organization like UNICEF to work more broadly with children around the world. And so we became a permanent part of the United Nations a few years later in the early 1950s. And then we went through a number of periods of our history where I think UNICEF did make some really groundbreaking efforts, and ones that spring to mind include a period in the 1980s when UNICEF was led by a very inspirational man called James Grant, who really sort of, I think, created the UNICEF that we know today. And he came up with this concept of what he called the child survival revolution. And this was really a concerted effort by UNICEF in the countries where it worked and with the governments that it worked with in those countries to really tackle some of the most basic challenges facing children's survival around their health and around their nutrition. And so, for example, we introduced one of the most simple but one of the most effective ways to save the lives of children who were suffering from water-related diseases. We don't see this as much nowadays, but it is still a challenge in some countries where children still only have access to very limited water supply and often very polluted and dirty water, which of course leads to sickness and poor health. And one of those sicknesses is diarrheal disease, where children become very dehydrated very, very quickly because of the diarrhea. And it can prove fatal. It can actually kill children. And so we came up with a very simple concept of what we call oral rehydration salts, which is a very long name for basically saying a little packet, sort of this big, which contains a mix of sugar and salt and basic water. And you mix that with clean water, and it can actually put back into a sick child all the necessary minerals that it needs to fight the diarrheal disease. And it saved millions of lives around this world, this very simple approach that could be made locally. It didn't have to be imported from around the world, and cost very little, just a few US cents for each packet. And it was literally a lifesaver, and it had never really been done before. You can go to the pharmacy today and you can still find these packets being sold commercially. So they're still used today around the world, but it was really a new initiative back in the 80s and saved, as I say, literally millions of lives. And I think another area where we made a huge difference is in the immunization programs. Now, again, there are many diseases in the world today that used to affect children that we don't really hear about very much because they don't really affect so many. We think about things like polio. Used to be a crippling disease for thousands of children around the world, sort of 20, 30 years ago. Now it's almost non-existent. Measles, another major killer of children, has been brought under control through basic immunization programs. I mean, you and your classmates will all have been immunized, I'm sure. Azerbaijan has a very high immunization rate for children. But this concept of basic vaccinations for all children in the first few years of their life was something that UNICEF really pioneered. And even in very complex situations, either because of conflicts or because of political challenges, UNICEF was often able to organize periods of 1, 2, or 3 days when really the life of a country would come to a stop and everyone would focus on immunization. So people would be volunteers, people would go out into the community to make sure that every child who needed to be vaccinated was identified, and then the health workers would get to them and ensure they got those vaccines. And I think we take it for granted now that, when we're kids, we all go to the doctor and we either get the oral vaccine or we get the injection in the arm. It's sort of standard, but it wasn't, not so long ago. And I think this real focus on immunization has fundamentally, phenomenally changed the lives of children. And then I think the other thing that the UNICEF has really focused so much attention on is on education. And really emphasizing how important it is that every child has a good basic education, at the very least at the primary level. And again, we see in most countries now more and more kids attending school on a regular basis. And that's been a huge area that we've invested in over many, many years. And I think education is something that really sets you up as young people for the rest of your lives. If you have the opportunity to have a good education, clearly you have much better opportunities as you get older. We know that kids who have a good education tend to be healthier adults because they have a better understanding of how to look after themselves. When they become parents, if they become parents, kids who are well educated tend to be parents that their children also have a better education, because parents who have been educated want their children to experience the same benefits. So education itself has what I call an intergenerational benefit. It transfers from one generation of children to another. And we still have a lot to do in terms of the quality of education in many countries, ensuring that every child from every social group has access to education. But again, if you look back over the last 40 years or so, we've seen such dramatic improvements in the access and the quality of education in so many countries. Now, looking at Azerbaijan, because you mentioned about UNICEF's plans here, we are actually about to start this year a new 5-year program here in Azerbaijan. Now, again, this is a country which, as you know, over the last 20 or so years since independence, has transformed enormously, and we've seen great progress for children in Azerbaijan over those years. The health of children has improved, the access to education has improved, the general economic situation of the country has improved dramatically. So people might ask, well, why should UNICEF still be working in a country like Azerbaijan? But we do know, and the government also recognizes here, that there are still some children who are being left behind. And as I said at the beginning, we want to make sure at UNICEF that every child has the same opportunity to benefit from progress. So we have a number of programs that we are developing this year and which will continue over the coming years. For example, a lot more work with children with disabilities, particularly ensuring that children with disabilities are able to attend regular schools alongside other children wherever possible. We sadly don't see a lot of children with disabilities in mainstream regular schools. But the government has made a very strong commitment to improving that situation, and we're working very closely with them, looking at the curriculum, looking at changes, and raising more awareness in communities with parents about the importance of mainstream education for kids with disabilities. We're putting a lot more focus now on how we can support parents with young children. We know, for example, that in the first 3 years or so of a child's life, it's a period when their brain develops at a speed that's faster than any other time in a child's life. It's a critical period of brain development. And if we can support parents with information and advice on the best nutrition for their young children, how to interact with their children, which helps also with the stimulation and the brain development, good parenting skills, how to care for your child, how to look after your child in a positive way, it actually has a big impact on this child's brain development, which goes on to have a positive benefit for them as they get older, they go into school, they learn better, they achieve more, their social skills are better as they grow older. So again, this is an area of work that can actually create a benefit that will last a lifetime. And this is quite a new area for Azerbaijan. It's something we started last year, looking at how we can support these early childhood development programs, and that's something that will continue. And I think, there are many other issues, but I think the other one I would just touch on is really ensuring that vulnerable families are not overlooked. Now, as I said, this is a country where there's been great economic progress over the last few years, and that's, of course, benefited many families. But we do know that some families are still struggling financially. There are families where there's only one parent trying to bring up their children. There are families where the parents maybe are sick or have a disability, and that makes it difficult for them to work and care for their children. And we know that the last year of where we had this coronavirus pandemic has probably had an impact on a lot of families in terms of their financial security, their incomes, people losing jobs perhaps, and maybe now finding it more difficult financially. So it's important that we know who those families are and that the right support is provided to them so that they don't slip further behind. And a very exciting initiative that we started last year with the government, and which will continue in our new program, is how we develop what we call social service programs. So these are trained social workers in the communities who can identify families who may be struggling or may be getting close to a point where they will begin to struggle. So we can intervene quickly, offer those families access to financial support through the government's programs, but also provide counseling and support for parents to better deal with their situation, and to connect those families to other services in areas like education and health, to make sure that the children in those families are getting access to all the support that they need. And again, this is quite a new initiative. It's something that the government is very keen to develop. It's been running in a couple of districts around the country as a sort of a practice model for the last year or so. And we're hopeful that as we move forward, this will become a nationwide program. And I think it will do two things. It will obviously help those families who are perhaps struggling now, but it will also help to identify quickly families who may be getting close to that point. And I think the earlier we can intervene and make sure that families have that type of support, then the impact of the difficulties they face can be reduced. So early intervention is always a good option. So there are lots of issues. We could talk about work we do with young people, work that we do around healthcare and nutrition and so on. There are still many things that need to be done to really make Azerbaijan the best country it can be for its children. But we certainly feel that there's been a lot of progress. The focus now is on making sure that that progress reaches everybody in the country.
Thank you, Mr. Carwardine.
Thank you very much. Yeah, equality here definitely is a very important issue right now, and I think we should do the best to achieve that. I personally wanted to ask you if there's anything that UNICEF may suggest for school children and adolescents dealing with post-lockdown depression, and what are some of the most common issues faced right now by these children?
Yeah, I mean, lockdown has affected all of us, hasn't it? And I mean, and here we are. I think looking at the two of you, and I'm sure others who are watching this, probably all sitting at home, right? Still, after so many months, we know that the quarantine measures have had a tough impact on young people. They were necessary. I mean, it's absolutely important to understand that the quarantine was vitally important to try and reduce the spread of the pandemic. But of course it has an impact, particularly for young people, who their education has been interrupted in many cases. The chance of having access to recreation and leisure time has been more difficult. And even just social contacts with friends has been more difficult because of the quarantine. And I think it does affect all of us in different ways. I've been working at home now, I think since March of last year. And I don't have a family, so I'm sort of working a lot by myself, and I know there've been some very difficult days adjusting to this new way of life. So I can only imagine how tough it's been for a lot of young people. And we are concerned about the mental health issues, and that's another area that we will be looking at more broadly in our new country program here in Azerbaijan, how we can support young people who maybe are a little bit on the mental health side. But I think, there are a couple of things, very practical things that I would also advise young people to do, despite the difficulties. I think the first thing is, if you are struggling, if you're feeling down, if you're feeling a little bit fed up, if you think that maybe it's getting too much, talk to people. I think, unfortunately, and not just in Azerbaijan, but all over the world, this issue of mental health problems amongst teenagers, whether it's depression or low self-esteem or just feeling sort of fed up with the world, young people are not often happy talking about it. They feel uncomfortable talking about it. They're worried about how people will react if they say, look, I'm having a really bad time at the moment. But we need to encourage young people to feel more comfortable to speak up. Speak to parents, speak to relatives, speak to your school teachers. Even if you're not in the school, I'm sure you still have contact with your network of school teachers. Speak up and say, look, I'm struggling, I'm finding it difficult. And that's the first way in which, we can try to find more professional help for those young people who need it. I mean, UNICEF's been doing a lot of work over the last year with the quarantine situation to train and provide counselors and psychologists who have been doing online sessions with young people to give them that space where they can talk and share their concerns. And I think often when young people find out that they're not alone, and that they're not the only ones who are feeling this way, it becomes a little bit easier to manage if you realize that there are others in the same situation, and you can share experiences and you can build some sort of solidarity with other young people. So I think that's the first thing. I think the second thing, and I know it hasn't been easy because of quarantine, but I think now it will perhaps improve a little bit, is to try and keep active. I think one of the biggest challenges of being stuck at home is you fall into a very strange routine where you kind of feel there's nothing you can do because you're sort of confined to your apartment or your room or wherever it is that you live. But I think the more you can find opportunities, even if it's just for a few hours a day, to get out, get some exercise, walk around, get some fresh air, you know, obviously wearing your mask, keeping your distance from others, but at least get out and do things. Maybe, you know, invest a little bit in your own learning, you know, put some a new hobby or a new skill, or maybe look at learning a language or something you can do at home, but keeps your brain active and keeps your mind focused. I mean, these are very simple things that it's not possible for everyone, I know that, but where you can look for these opportunities. But absolutely the first thing I would say to anyone who is feeling that this is getting too much, it's getting too difficult to cope with, talk to somebody, even if it's just your parents or your grandparents or your uncle or your aunt or your school teacher or your classmate, you know, and just say, look, I'm having a tough time. The minute you start to talk about it, often we find it becomes a little bit easier to manage.
Because others can relate as well. We are all in the same boat. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Carwardine. So, the 11th grade students, Fatima Jabarova, and 10th grade student of the 10I, Said Alesgarov, wanted to know, what did UNICEF do to help children who suffered from the First and the Second Wars between Armenia and Azerbaijan? And how does UNICEF Azerbaijan help or plan to help children that lost their parents and relatives during the recent conflict?
Well, UNICEF began working in Azerbaijan just after the end of the First War in the 1990s. And our role there, a little bit like how UNICEF began in the end of the Second World War, as I mentioned back in 1946, providing similar support. You know, we were providing, you know, blankets and supplies for families who have been affected by that conflict, food support, medical care, and so on for children. So what we call a real humanitarian operation. We developed into other areas of work. Our response to the most recent escalation of the conflict has been very similar. So to give you some examples, we've been working with our partners at the Ministry of Labour and Social Protection to provide food packages for several thousand families who were affected directly by the conflict in some of the districts. And these, you know, contain enough sort of basic food supplies to support a family for a month or so. We've been providing that on a regular basis since the conflict. We've also been providing what we called household kits. We know a lot of families had to leave their homes even temporarily because of the conflict, and they had to leave behind basic things like cooking utensils and so on, household items. So we've been providing kits again for families who needed those very simple items just to sort of get through day by day, particularly if they were living in shelters or temporary accommodation. And also hygiene kits, which contain things like soap and shampoos and personal hygiene items, again, which are very, very important for families who've had to suddenly leave their homes quickly and leave things behind. Thankfully, now we know many families, most families, I think, now have started to return home to their original homes. So hopefully those needs will reduce a little bit in the month ahead, getting that support now with our government partners. We've also been very aware that, of course, children were really went through some very difficult psychological experiences because of the conflict. So we've been working with the State Committee for Family, Women and Children, another one of our key government partners, to train child psychologists and special counsellors who are now working in many districts affected by the conflict, first of all, to identify children who may be experiencing some psychological impact of what they went through, and then ensuring that they have one-to-one support and care and group counselling and so on. That's reaching, I know, in many districts, hundreds of families every week with this type of very professional psychological support. I was actually in Aghabadi just before the new year, and I met some of the counsellors working on that program and some of the families who are being supported, and I know it's critically important. work with the SAN volunteers to help identify families who might need that type of support. And it goes back, I think, Fatia, you were asking about, how young people can get involved. This is a very good example. I saw so many young people working with the ASAN network to provide that support with UNICEF's help. We're also providing assistance on the health care side. We've now established with Tabib, the government health agency, and with the local district authorities in Agdam, in Agdabadi, and now I think in Fizuli also, what we call baby-friendly rooms. Now these are rooms within an existing health clinic, where first of all we can provide these early learning opportunities, early childcare opportunities and support for families. So mothers can bring their young kids in, excuse me, and we have a group of young volunteers working with REAP, which is another well-known NGO here. They're providing this early childhood care in these rooms, while the mum goes and gets checked out by a doctor in the health clinic. So we provide this sort of joint service, and that again is now reaching several thousand mothers and kids every week in those districts. And then one other area that I think is particularly important in relation to the recent escalation is we know that there is still, unfortunately, a lot of unexploded ordnance, bits of munitions that landed in the districts which didn't explode. These, of course, create a real risk to kids who have a habit of wanting to pick things up and see what things are. And obviously, we want to avoid children being killed or injured as a result of this unexploded ammunition. So we're working with ANAMA, which is the National Agency for Mine Action. As you know, they do a lot of clearance of these unexploded ordnance, but we also work with them to provide awareness and education to young people, so they know what things look like. They know what not to do if they see something that looks suspicious, and importantly, who they can call to let them know that they found something, so someone can come and professionally clear it. And we're doing that through a mixture of providing sort of printed materials that are being distributed through the districts, but also more sort of group awareness sessions in the community. So bringing young people together and showing them what these things look like and how to keep themselves safe. So a number of activities, and we'll continue these while they're needed. And hopefully they're having some impact on improving the lives of kids who really suffered so much because of that recent conflict.
Thank you, Mr. Carwardine. We certainly appreciate all your effort put down to improve some our country problems.
Thank you very much, Mr. Carwardine. It was very interesting to hear that. I would also like to ask, what does UNICEF currently do to help children suffering from different mental illnesses?
Well, as I mentioned before, I mean, we talked about the challenges that youngsters face because of the COVID quarantine. I mean, this is becoming an increasingly, I think, important area of attention, not just in Azerbaijan. We're beginning, I think, to understand better now around the world how people do struggle sometimes, on the psychological side in terms of mental health. I talked a little bit earlier about how a child's brain goes through this very rapid period of development in the first 3 years of its life, particularly in terms of its learning skills, its interaction with others, and so on. We also know that for adolescents, so young people, so the age of 12 and 13, 14, they also go through a period of very rapid brain development, but it's a different part of the brain. It's the part of the brain that manages emotions, decision-making. It affects their young people's judgment, how they decide if something is good or bad. And that period of emotional brain development lasts for a few years, and then it sort of gets locked. So, after that point, there isn't really any more significant brain development in a human being. Now, that emotional part, of course, is extremely important because it can affect the way in which a young people relates with others for the rest of its life. It can affect the way a young person sees the world in terms of their impressions, their attitude towards others. These feelings are really sort of created in this period of adolescence, and then they can last for the duration of a young person's adulthood. So if a young person, for example, is experiencing violence in the home or sees violent activity around them, we know that very often that young person will grow up thinking that violence is a perfectly normal way of life. And there is a risk that that young person themselves then becomes a violent person because they just see it as, oh, that's normal, you know? So ensuring that, you know, we provide the right support for this emotional development amongst teenagers is important, but it's not something perhaps that's been given enough attention in the past. And we're trying to change that now. So, for example, in our new program that we're now starting with the government here, we're going to look much more at what we can do through the school system, for example. You know, how can we train teachers better to identify a sign that maybe a young person is going through some mental health challenges, and how can that young person then be connected with professionals, psychiatrists or psychologists or counselors, for example. I mentioned before this new program of social workers in the community, you know, part of whose job is to identify families who may be struggling, where there may be a young person with mental health issues, and to identify that early on so that the right support can be provided to help that young person quickly, because speed is very important. Intervening quickly and helping that young person early on is extremely important. I think also just raising awareness, you know, that again, you know, we were talking about this before, that there is, you know, what we call stigma associated with mental health, you know, that people see this as kind of a bad thing. It's not something you should be proud of. It's not something you ever want to talk about. We need to change that attitude as well. A mental health issue is no different fundamentally from any other health issue. You know, if somebody's sick, they're sick and they need to get support. Mental health should be seen no differently than that, you know, and that young people should not feel scared or nervous about speaking up and saying, I'm having a difficult time, I'm having some difficulties with emotions and so on. We've also been doing a lot of work for the last few years with young people here in what we call our basic life skills program. This is something that we've developed with the Ministry of Youth and Sport and with the Azerbaijan Youth Foundation and others, which provides skills training for young people, not in terms of practical skills really, but in terms of their social skills, their communication skills, how they can resolve conflicts with other young people in a positive and productive way, confidence building, relationship skills with others. And this, of course, is also a very important part of helping young people have a better mental attitude, being able to, you know, deal with their emotions more effectively, and most importantly, feeling confident to speak up if they're having difficulties or struggling. So I think these different combined efforts in the years ahead will hopefully have some impact in supporting young people. We know, and I'm sure you've seen it, you know, in the last couple of years, there were some very high-profile cases of young people who took their own lives, who committed suicide. I think that's something all of us should feel some responsibility for. No young person should reach a point where the only option that they see left is to take their own life, to end their own life. You know, and I don't even know how to express just how sad that makes me, that a young person reaches that point in their life when really they don't see any other option. We need to be better at recognizing the signs of a young person going through difficulties, whether it's in the family or in the classroom, if they're being bullied, if they're facing academic pressure, if there are pressures at home, whatever it may be. We all have a responsibility, you know, to look for that in young people that we know around us. And most importantly, then to speak up and say, I'm concerned about this young person. You know, if we look the other way, you know, we have this sort of phrase in English that if we don't like looking over the wall into, you know, if we feel that that's not our business, then we should take the responsibility for what happens to that young person as well. And we need to break this attitude. It's okay to look over the wall. It's okay to knock on the door and say, is everything okay? Is there anything we can do to help? We share that responsibility, I think, as a community and as a society. So it's also down to us as individuals to do our bit to help these young people.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Mr. Carwardine. So the next question is presented from the 7th grade student, 7A, Alisa Babajanova. So she would like to know, how are the countries that violate UNICEF regulations penalized?
Okay, well, Lisa, let me start by saying that there aren't really UNICEF regulations. I mean, it's not UNICEF that sort of sets rules, and then we don't act as a sort of a police officer to enforce them. The way that the countries regulate the way that they care for children and support the rights of children really comes from within those countries themselves. So let's go back again, if you don't mind, a little bit in history, back to 1990. This was when the countries of the world, through the UN General Assembly, created what we call the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And some of you may know a little bit about this. This is basically the global standard for how countries should respect child rights. But it was created by countries themselves. It wasn't UNICEF that created this. It was developed by the member states of the United Nations as individual countries. It's been signed now by, I think, pretty much every country in the world has now signed the convention. Azerbaijan was one of the first countries to sign it as well. So countries themselves say, these are the rights that children have, and we commit ourselves to respecting those rights. So there isn't really a sort of a punishment system if a country doesn't live up to its obligations. Because these are the commitments that countries themselves have made, and they believe are important for the children in their countries, whether that's the right to education, the right to healthcare, the right to leisure, the right to protection from harm, the right not to be married before you become an adult, etc., etc. So really countries are responsible for regulating themselves. Now, UNICEF's role is to provide the support and the guidance where necessary to help countries meet those expectations. Now, we do that through a lot of technical advice by sharing good practices from other countries. So in some countries, providing financial assistance, where perhaps countries don't have the resources themselves to put in place the policies or the services or the programs that enable those rights of children to be fully met. So in Azerbaijan, a lot of our work is around good policy, better legislation, developing these models of new services that we test and demonstrate the effectiveness of, and then the government hopefully takes them to scale children. And I'm a great believer that if you want a country or a community or even a family to do the right thing for children, to really respect children's rights, we have to show why it's to their best interest, why it's to their advantage to do that as well. So it's not just about do it because it's the right thing to do. I think we also need to demonstrate that it makes sense to invest in a child's education, for example. So, if we can show that if you, educate your children well, and every child gets an education, there is a positive impact on that child's ability to go on later in life and have a meaningful job with a good income, and they can then support their own families and themselves when they become adults. That reduces the pressure on the government to support an adult who isn't working and therefore needs more assistance. If we reduce violence in the home, if we protect children from violence, that has a positive impact on society as a whole. Often we see less substance abuse, we see less crime in society where children are not exposed to violence. That has a positive impact and a positive benefit for a country that wants to grow and develop successfully. And you can look at it across all the different rights of children. If we encourage the right of children to speak up, to participate, to engage in decision-making that affects them, we start to build a sense of confidence and leadership amongst young people that will have a positive benefit as they move into positions of authority when they become adults. So UNICEF's approach is very much not about punishing or penalizing governments that don't uphold children's rights, but much more to say it's in your interest to do this, and we can show that if you make these investments, if you make these commitments, your country as a whole will receive the benefit. I think that's a more effective way. I mean, I could sit here and say, you're bad, you're good, you're bad. It probably won't make very much difference. But if we can show that there is a benefit to a country of making these investments and upholding these rights, I think that's a more effective approach.
Yes, it certainly makes sense. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Carwardine. Our grade 8R student, Nigar Emirbeva, wants to ask how to overcome gender stereotypes and providing equal access to education, both for girls and boys.
Well, this is certainly a big issue globally. I think we mentioned it a little bit. I think, Fatia, you said yourself, equity and equality, big issue in many countries. I think in Azerbaijan, there has been some really positive progress in trying to create more equality for girls. We have a little bit more to do, and I think this is also recognized by the government here, but also in society in general. I think there are a number of different approaches. I mean, one of the most fundamental ones for me is about, again, increasing an understanding and appreciation that girls are no different from boys in terms of the rights that they enjoy. It goes back to the previous question about, how do we, show society that investing in girls is a positive investment and will deliver benefits for everyone. If we leave girls behind, if they drop out of school, if they become married before they're adults, that has huge potential implications for their health, for the health of a child if they give birth as a mother when they're too young, and it's going to be society that has to sort of pick up the bill and pay for the care for those families. Also, every girl that's not in school is a missed opportunity for the country as a whole in terms of its economic development, its social development, and so on. So I think it's important to make the key argument that investing in a girl's education not only has a benefit for that girl, but has a benefit to all of us, and there is good evidence to show that. An educated mother is less likely to have sick children than a mother who wasn't educated, for example. We know that if as women leave school, go into the workplace, and do decide to become parents, if the employers support those women with the right facilities so that they can balance working and being a mother, actually those mothers tend to be more productive. They take less time off work sick or time away from work to look after their kids. That has a great benefit for the employer. They have there are lots of benefits that we can demonstrate about these investments. But I think the critical thing for me is in some countries, it's a little bit here in Azerbaijan, I have to say, is that often, girls are seen as being less valuable than boys generally. Considering this is a country which has, developed so rapidly in the last 25 years or so, a country which is now a very strong economic power in the region and if not globally, it's interesting that still we see that the ratio between the number of boys who are born and the number of girls is one of the worst in the world. Way more boys are born in Azerbaijan than girls, and it's not sort of backed up on any sort of scientific basis. What this means is that girls who are conceived, are not being born. Now that means that someone is making a decision not for that girl not to be born because it's a girl, not a boy, and that's really worrying. I mean, it has huge implications, by the way, for the population. If we have lots of boys and not enough girls, that's going to have an impact on the whole population in years to come, let alone the social issues and the basic rights of that girl to be born, not just to be conceived, but also to be. People feel that girls, or why do some people feel that girls are less valuable than boys? We've really got to get to understand that better and start to tackle that. And I think part of it, from my experience in other countries, it's a traditional view, that boys are going to be the workers, they're going to support the family, they're going to support their parents when they grow up. A boy is therefore more valuable to the family. So we need to tackle that by showing that actually girls can make the same contribution, if not sometimes a greater contribution. And one of the ways we can do that is by really, putting a focus on girls and young women in society who have been successful. Now, I mean, if we look at the number of women in Azerbaijan who have gone on to be scientists, who have gone on to be artists, who have gone on to be business women, we need to find those examples and draw more attention to them, and really establish these role models in society to show the positive contribution that girls and young women can make if we make the right investments and give them the right support. And it begins, as you say, with education, first and foremost. We at UNICEF have been working here in Azerbaijan with the National Football Federation, AFA, with a campaign for a number of years called Girls Can. And this campaign really does exactly what I just said. It identifies good role models, successful women, not necessarily the most famous women, but women who have been very successful in their field, and showcasing their talents and their skills and what they can offer as a way of breaking down this sort of stereotype that somehow boys are better than girls. What I found very interesting, just to give you a quick example, is about 2 years ago when we started this campaign with the Football Federation, with AFA, on the AFA website, on their social media site, they were running some videos of young women playing football and playing it very well, I have to say. And some comments came up from the audience, obviously from men, saying, but this is stupid. Girls don't play football. This is a man's sport. And immediately a lot of other reactions came in saying, are you crazy? They're better than our male players sometimes. It's like, the women's football team is doing better than the men's football team. And what happened was this big debate started on the social media platform. Now some people may say, well, it's terrible that anyone should say, a girl can't play football. I was actually quite happy because it created a debate and it created a conversation. And it got people to sort of challenge these stereotypes and these old-fashioned ideas. That's what we need to do more. We need to have, a debate, a discussion, around, the role of girls in society, the contribution that they can make in society, and the equality that they're entitled to in society. And there will be some people who argue against it, and I say, come on, bring your arguments, because we're ready for them. And in fact, you and your fellow girls in school should be at the forefront of this effort, to really demonstrate that, we are as good as, and often much better than, the boys around us.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I also think that raising awareness on this and educating people on this topic is very important to improving people's attitude towards it.
Thank you, Mr. Carwardine. So now we've come to the last question of the day. So this question was raised by the 10th grade student, 10I to be exact, Said Al-Asgarov. He wanted to know, how can UNICEF raise awareness of the importance of COVID-19 vaccination?
Right. Well, this is the hot topic all around the world right now. Is at long last we're seeing the beginning of a vaccination program against COVID. I think we're all very relieved to see that we've got to that point, and so quickly as well. The government in Azerbaijan is starting now the rollout of an immunization campaign. Many people will have seen, the first vaccines now being delivered. Quite rightly, the government is following the international recommendations that we target the most at-risk groups first. So, for example, health workers, the elderly will be amongst the first to receive the vaccine as it comes. But, in the months ahead, hopefully we'll see the vaccination program rolling out to more and more people in the general public. I think it's important that we have confidence in the vaccine program. It has been developed very quickly, and of course that is a big topic of discussion, I know, but certainly it's been well regulated. Excuse me, and I think we will also be monitoring very closely, the success of the program in other countries. But clearly there's good evidence to show that this is an effective protection against coronavirus. So I think we need to be careful that we don't listen to some of the misinformation that's flying around about vaccination. I'm pretty confident in saying that there isn't a little microchip hidden in the vaccine that's going to track all of our movements, or some of the other crazy stories that we hear. This is a vaccine in the same way that we've been vaccinating kids, as I said before, against polio, against measles, against meningitis, against tetanus, and so on. For many years, very successfully, and those vaccines had a huge impact on protecting the health, not just of children, but of the community at large. And we need to see the COVID vaccination program in the same way. But it will take time. I mean, for obvious reasons, you know, this is a vaccine that everyone in the world is going to want and going to need. There is a limited capacity in terms of production. As we know, you need 2 shots of the vaccine, so it's not just one time. So it will take time before the coverage levels here in Azerbaijan are high enough for us to feel that there is now full protection. So I think the important message from me today is that while we wait for the vaccination, even if you are one of those who gets vaccinated early on, we still have to keep following measures. That means wearing the face mask when we're out in public, keeping our social distance from others outside of our households, keep washing those hands, you know, soap and water, or using the sanitizer, you know, limiting our exposure to crowded areas. And particularly now, I think, with the restaurants about to reopen in many parts of the country, of course, people are going to want to rush to catch up with their friends and family in restaurants. But it is the winter, which means we're all going to be sitting inside, not outside as we were in the summer. You know, that does increase the risk of transmission. So it's so important that people follow the basic precautionary measures that they have been doing for the last year. It's not one or the other. It's not either get vaccinated or wear your face mask. We have to do both until the coverage levels are high enough that the medical experts say that we can now relax a little bit on some of the other preventative measures. But let's hope. I think it's been a long time coming, but now we're here. We're about to see the vaccination program. I hope people will have confidence in it, but I hope people will also be patient because it will take time for the program to scale up to reach more and more people. And in the meantime, please keep wearing your masks, keep washing those hands, keep your distance, and limit the amount of time you spend in crowded areas, particularly when you're inside.
Thank you, Mr. Carwardine. Of course, all the sanitation process is meant to protect us from infecting COVID-19 virus. And I'd like to say we've come to an end of this wonderful event. And once again, I would like to say it was a privilege to have you here. We know that you're a very busy person, and we are very thankful for your time. We appreciate it, and getting to learn everything a bit deeply, I understood some certain facts, and I appreciate all the effort that was put to increase some aspects of our country. So thank you very much for your attention, Mr. Carwardine.
Really, it's been my pleasure. Thank you, both of you, Fatih and Rafiq, and all your fellow students who put together such interesting questions. It's also a good experience for me. It's a good way of testing my own knowledge as well. So thank you very much indeed. I know that we're getting close to the day when schools may start to reopen again. I know, again, it will take a little bit of time before everything is back to normal. Let's hope that it's not too much of a shock when you do go back to the classrooms. I think it's been difficult being at home, but we've got used to it a little bit. It may be more strange to go back to the classroom, but when you do go back, all of you who are watching today, good luck. I wish you every success. And remember that the future of this country, a country that I've been very privileged to work in for several years, is going to be in your hands. So make the most of it and make us proud. Thank you so much, all of you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Carwardine. It has been a great pleasure to have you here today. We really hope to see you at our school once the lockdown measures are lifted. Thank you very much.
Teşekkür ederim. Thank you.
Teşekkür ederim.
For your time. Thank you very much.